Hello and welcome. A donkey sitting on a gold mine. Perhaps not the most flattering description, but one that's often used for Bolivia. It remains one of South America's poorest countries in spite of its rich resources. Well, now Bolivia stands at a crossroads. One path follows the populist president, Evo Morales, and his support for the needy indigenous population. And another path rejects his ambitious, some say impossible, projects to bridge the gap between rich and poor. Riding a wave of contempt for elitist politicians in 2005, Morales swept into power and became the first Bolivian president to come from the indigenous population. He undertook bold moves to include the country's historically excluded indigenous majority and get greater state control over natural resources. Well, this has run into many obstacles, and today he faces an all-out revolt by the governors of Bolivia's richer provinces who want autonomy from the state. His anti-US rhetoric has brought him very close to Venezuela's leader, Hugo Chavez, but has caused tensions with Washington. Now he has called for a referendum next month where Bolivians will be asked to choose between him and the rebel governors. On the show we ask, can this divided country find a way to unite and to heal relations with the United States? And don't forget, we take your calls on this show, and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Joining me here in Washington, D.C. is Jaime Aparicio, the former Bolivian ambassador to the United States. The ambassador is currently vice president of the Inter-American Judicial Committee, which is an agency of the Organization of American States. Also with us is John Perkins, an activist for indigenous rights in South America and author of several books about his career as an economic hitman, as he calls it. Mr. Perkins says his job was to strap developing countries with massive debt, which tended to benefit the West more than the poor countries. Now, welcome both of you to the show.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Ambassador, if I could start with you and ask what's at the heart of it? What's President Morales trying to achieve in Bolivia right now?
Well, as you know, Bolivia is in this moment very divided because President Morales has been elected, as you know, with the largest majority than any president in our modern history. He had more than 53% of the votes. And what he, in my criteria, never understood is that Bolivia is a very complex country, is a very diverse country, and the indigenous population is part of that country, but the country has also other ethnic groups, other regional interests, and everybody was expecting that he could unite the country. Everybody voted with him with that idea, and what's happening now is that he had an agenda that was very good for the highlands, was very appropriate for the social movements and for the indigenous people, but was not acceptable for the richer departments of Bolivia.
So where does his popularity, where does his support level stand right now in the country then?
That's also a very tricky issue because he is very popular in the highlands. That's it's obvious that in El Alto, for example, probably he has more than 80%, and El Alto has become it's probably one of the biggest rural city in Latin America, has around 1 million people. In La Paz, in Oruro, in all the highlands, he is, has a support that is up to 60 or more %. The problem is that in the lowlands, in Santa Cruz, in Tarija, in Chuquisaca, in Beni and Pando, where they are probably the wealthiest apartments, where the agro industry is located, with the gas is located, he has a very low approval.
Right. John Perkins, good to have you back on the show, and I wonder from the perspective of the population in Bolivia, what is the population facing now at this crossroads? What options do they have?
You know, I was very struck when I was in Bolivia about 1.5 years ago, and I met with President Morales, among others, and struck by this tremendous expectation that the people who voted him in, the indigenous people, had an expectation that if he became president, suddenly everything was going to get better. And of course the opposition, which is pretty much aligned with Washington, was doing everything to not allow him to move forward with his programs. So it's a very difficult situation where you've got the people who voted you into office expecting you to do something overnight, which of course none of us can do, and then this very strong opposition that's aligned with the United States that's trying very, very hard to overthrow you. You know, I think we, as citizens in the United States, as I am, really need to take a look at the way our country reacts. We should be supporting democratically elected presidents like Morales, regardless of whether they're trying to take more of the profits from their resources and not allow our corporations to make it or not.
So supporting true democracy in Europe.
Yeah, you know, we too frequently, and this is happening in many countries in Latin America right now, where the presidents are saying, we want more of our resources to benefit our people and not go to big corporations. The big corporations can be here, but they've got to give more of the profits to our people, and we're taking exception to that as a country, and it's totally against our principles.
So how serious is the recent fallout with the U.S.? We had the U.S. ambassador sort of fleeing effectively for a while and coming back now. The Undersecretary of State for the Western Hemisphere, Thomas Shannon's in Bolivia right now meeting. How serious is this relationship? How seriously rocked is the relationship?
Well, you know, from my perspective, what's going on is you've now got 9 countries in Latin America representing more than 80% of the population of South America who've recently democratically voted in presidents that are saying no more exploitation of our resources. We want a fair shake. And I think in a way, Bolivia is flexing its muscles as part of that system. In the past, if any one country had tried to do this, their leader would have been taken out one way or another. Economic hitmen would have gone in and corrupted him, or somebody would have gone in and had a coup or even an assassination, as we did with Roldos and Torrijos in Panama and Ecuador, as I talk about in my books. But today, because you've got 9 countries, and they're all different, but in different levels, but basically they're all saying something very similar philosophically. And so I think Morales is being very courageous and standing up to this. It's a difficult position for him, there's no question about it.
Ambassador, how significant is the reaction against America that's taken place in Bolivia over the U.S. Granting asylum to the former Bolivian defense minister, Carlos Sanchez Berzian? Of course, there's the whole history of his involvement in the protests and the death of more than 60 people there. How significant is it to the Bolivian people that the U.S. has said, well, we're willing to offer him some security here?
Well, first of all, I would say very briefly one thing, and it's also important for this analysis, is that the U.S. companies are not important in Bolivia. There's no large U.S. investment in Bolivia, and that's very important. So the largest investor in the gas industry is Brazil in Bolivia. Right. The Italian telecommunications company, so they are transnational companies in Bolivia, but the U.S. is not a major player in Bolivia. In the case of Sanchez Berzain, and there is a thing that nobody says, is that the extradition has to be, you know, it's a judicial procedure that has to be asked to the U.S. government. At this point, nobody asked for the extradition. If you read the newspapers, they are going to ask for the extradition. And that goes to the State Department. From the State Department goes to the Minister of Justice of the United States, to the Justice Department, and they have to take a judicial decision. So it's not on the hands of the State Department or of the U.S. government to decide about that. It has to be decided on the merits of a juridical case. So that's where we are now. What they send, it's by 1 or 2 years ago, is a notification that he's going to be sued by the Supreme Tribunal in Bolivia. But the extradition is not yet delivered to the U.S. authorities.
Now, John, of course, we've got, continuing with this theme of what the sort of fragmented relationship that Bolivia has with the U.S. Last month, the coca growers in Chapare State or province kicked out USAID workers, USAID workers, and how unusual is this as an expression of power by the sort of what is essentially a relatively small group or relatively powerless group otherwise?
Well, it's pretty unusual. You know, I've known of a lot of cases around the world where people would have liked to have done that. There's often been a suspicion that USAID is used as a tool of the corporatocracy, to further U.S. interests and corporate interests. But very seldom does something like that actually happen. And I think the ambassador's point was a most interesting one, that the U.S. really doesn't have much investment in Bolivia. But like in Iran in the 50s, when the CIA basically overthrew Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, we had very few investments there. It was the British oil company that we were defending. But the point really was that we were defending the right of foreign companies and foreign governments to intercede, and whether it's our own companies or not, it's a principle that we have supported wrongly, because it's totally against the principles of the United States.
Keeping the doors open, basically.
Yeah, and it's putting down democratically elected presidents in favor of basically a form of colonialism, a form of imperialism.
Any surprise that these coca growers turned to Venezuela's Hugo Chavez for help then?
I'm not surprised to see that. I think Chavez has indicated his willingness to help in such situations. You know, in the past, if people were discontent, like these coca growers, they might turn to Russia or China, back before détente. And always when that happened, it was a balancing point. So if people started to do that, if a country threatened to go to Russia, the United States then would ease off. Now, since détente, there really hasn't been that balancing force, but in Latin America, Chavez, in a way, represents that balancing force. It gets the attention of the United States, and usually, when something like that happens, then we start to change our policies and soften up a little bit.
Ambassador, I've got to ask you to make that comparison of if there is a natural one between Venezuela and Bolivia, considering how the politics have gone in both countries, and especially between Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez.
Yeah, there is a very close relation. That's undeniable, and there's a large influence of President Chavez on President Morales. I would say that there are three elements in this relation with the United States and with Venezuela that are very important. The first one is that in the case of Chapare and the cooperation agency is that no longer the Coca issue is on the U.S. mainstream agenda. And that's because most of the Coca and the cocaine is now going through Brazil, through Europe. So almost zero cocaine is coming to the United States. And that's important because that's one of the reasons that it's not a major issue as it was 10 years ago. The second is that the USA cooperation is now irrelevant. 5 years ago, Bolivia needed that money. Now he has Chavez support. He gives checks directly through his embassy, directly to some mayors, directly to the government, so they have cash to use in any way they want. It's not accountable. It's not in the budget of the country. It's money that comes directly from Venezuela. USAID money was half for military training in the Chapare, and the other half was for consultants and also for some projects and some health programs. So at this point, it's irrelevant. And the third thing is that the US has lost weight in Latin America. That's for sure. And in the case of Venezuela, has replaced the United States in a very strange way, has replaced the role that the US used to have in Bolivia, is now Venezuela.
Well, gentlemen, stay tuned. I'm going to just take a very short break here. Now we'll be back with more on this discussion about Bolivia in a moment.